Just as York is synonymous with Vikings, Colchester with Romans, Ironbridge with the Industrial Revolution, and Bath with the Regency, when visitors to Norwich carry out even the most superficial research, they are encouraged to think Norwich, think medieval. That proposition was also supported by the renowned scholar of architectural history, Nicholas Pevsner. Best known for his monumental 46-volume series of county-by-county guides, he asserted that Norwich has an undisturbed medieval centre with winding streets and alleys. And it's remarkable that should the current city tourist plan be laid alongside a copy of Taylor's map of Norwich before the dissolution of the monasteries, today's roads and streets are a near identical match to those of the pre-1530s. Its ecclesiastic heritage also gives the city a worldwide reputation for having the largest collection of medieval churches north of the Alps. 31 still survive from the 58 that were in active service in the 11th and 12th centuries. Those churches, along with the soaring monument of medieval masonry that is Norwich Cathedral, and the solid construct of the Norman castle, are emblematic of Norwich's past predominance. But when it comes to the secular, there is one architectural gem which is often missed by enthusiastic tourists looking for medieval England. That is Dragon Hall, the subject of this presentation. It is a unique building which has a fascinating life history and whose origins have not been determined from documented records but from academic and archaeological investigation. It's a story of entrepreneurship and success, civic achievement, development, change of use, hidden identity, dereliction, rediscovery and restoration. Medieval Norwich was contained and enveloped within the early 14th century walls and gates, which were completed in 1343 through the generosity of merchant Richard Spink. The walls did not completely encircle the city because, on its eastern edge, it was believed that the north-south flowing River Wensum would provide an efficient natural barrier in times of conflict. Nevertheless, it was felt necessary to control the movement of traffic on the river, and, still extant by Conisford at the southeast limit of the city, are twin boom towers which had two great chains of good Spanish iron strung between them, across the river so that no barge or boat might come in or depart without leave nor against the will of those who govern the city. And it is at Conisford, from the Danish King's Ford, which is the area where Dragon Hall came to be built. Its location, nestling just within the walls in the southeast corner of the city, immediately adjacent to the winding River Wensum, and on the arterial road leading to the sheep-rearing agricultural region to the north of Norwich, which was a pragmatic business decision made by Robert Topps the Mercer when he established his enterprise there in 1427. For those not familiar with Dragon Hall's strategic location, the present-day map of Norwich sits neatly alongside its medieval precursor and sets it in context with other better-known buildings and features. When we give on-site guided tours to visitors, we often begin by standing on the Lady Julian Bridge across the Wensum, named after the medieval mystic Julian of Norwich, the anchoress who lived in a cell attached to St Julian's Church, not 200 metres from Dragon Hall. Not only does that position allow an unusual from-the-river rear view of the building, but it emphasises the critical importance of the river to the city of Norwich. Just like any early watercourse, it provided drinking water and food for the indigenous population, and because it was navigable, an easier way to transport bulky goods when roads were of poor quality. But it also encouraged invasion. The Viking king Sweyn Forkbeard came with his fleet and completely ravaged and burned the Anglo-Saxon borough in 1004, and the Normans chose it as their regional capital because of its accessibility via the Wensum to the North Sea, just 20 miles to the east at Great Yarmouth. That led to waves of immigration from French and Jewish settlers in the 11th and 12th centuries, followed by religious refugees from the Netherlands in the mid-16th century. Norfolk's geographical location on the east side of England and its proximity to Europe and the world beyond, combined with the readily navigable, gently flowing River Wensum, and these were the raison d'etre for the county and city's success between 1066 and 1550. It's difficult to comprehend that today. Although this sparsely inhabited region with a modest economy, for 500 years it was the most densely populated and prosperous region in the kingdom, with its sole city second in size and affluence only to London. That came about because of the trading links stretching from Iceland to the Mediterranean. Agriculture was the basis of Norfolk's wealth. Wheat and barley and other arable crops, dairy produce, fish and wool were the most important exports through King's Lynn and Great Yarmouth, but there were reciprocal imports of manufactured and more exotic products. By the 14th and 15th centuries, woolen cloths, particularly from Norwich, were highly profitable commodities and the mainstay of Robert Tops's thriving business activities. Norwich remained a port well into the 20th century, but let's not jump too far ahead in our story. It was not until the 1940s that people began to question what might be the history of a certain row of ancient buildings in King Street. And it was not until the 1960s, the period when the search for our heritage became a populist pursuit, that academics from the University of East Anglia took a particular interest in secular buildings and the origins of what we now know as Dragon Hall. In 1987, archaeologists began to scrape away centuries of soil beneath its cellars and exposed the earliest settlement on the site, post holes of Anglo-Saxon huts or cottages. This showed that people had been living and working on this site over 1,000 years ago. Very close to the waterline and just outside the city proper, the inhabitants were involved in local economic life. Fishing in the Wensum and working bone and antler into tools, possibly for digging out chalk and flints from behind the thick bed of calcareous deposits which rose steeply and close by behind them. Other tools from a much later period, such as implements for finishing cloth, were also discovered. And the massive brickwork base of a 16th or 17th century chimney stack and the opening up of a Victorian coal chute revealed that many changes and additions had been made on the site in the previous millennium. This sketch of a low-status dwelling would have been typical in the Anglo-Saxon Scandinavian period. These small domestic buildings had simple corner posts whose holes had been found in the archaeological dig. Timber walls filled in with wattle and daub, clay floors and thatched roofs. Despite living in somewhat basic conditions, the residents had access to a varied diet of fish, berries, root vegetables, meats and grains, the remains of which were also discovered during the archaeological investigation. Leaving the Anglo-Saxon Scandinavian period behind us, we do know that the entirety of King Street was developed along the whole of its length between the 11th and 13th centuries. There were 13 post-conquest churches, and the Austin Friars were established just north of what we now call the Dragon Hall site, and it was owned by the Abbey of Woburn. This was not unusual for the times. Cistercian monasteries owned several sites near the river in Norwich. Herring from Yarmouth was probably preserved here in a timber smokehouse before being transported inland to sustain the monks in Bedfordshire. The other part of the site was owned by a well-off clerk and property developer named John Page. In the 1330s, he built an open hall house at right angles to the street, with his front door opening into the lane leading down towards the river. This hall house was timber framed with a typical layout of the time. A large central room without a ceiling, but extending up to the thatched roof, with a half at its focal point, housed his family. The rising smoke cured the thatch and protected it from infestation by insects and vermin. Their private sleeping chamber was curtained off on a raised dais at the eastern end. The main doorway, as you see it in the plan, led into a screens passage, with doors into the service areas of pantry and buttery to the left. This remains an entrance today, and the layout is identical to how it was 700 years ago. John Page was a member of the professional classes, and his was clearly a substantial property. In addition to the spacious above-ground living accommodation, he had a brick-vaulted undercroft, which also survives to the present day, and was extended by Robert Topps when he acquired the site in 1427. In common with other higher status buildings, such as the Guildhall, the Music House, the Bridewell Museum, and Strangers' Hall, there are over 60 undercrofts in Norwich, cut into the thick band of chalk which forms an important substrate beneath the county. Undercrofts are valuable for storing material at a constant temperature and are secure from theft. Perhaps their principal benefit is that they are fireproof. So, in the period when most properties were timber framed, even when a building was razed to the ground by fire, the undercroft and its contents were undamaged. The undercroft still contains a beer chute and barrels, a reference to the period when the building above was redeveloped as public houses between the 18th and 20th centuries. We now need to turn our attention to the principal character in the story of Dragon Hall, Master Robert Topps. We know little of his origins, and there is no record of his place or date of birth, but we do know that he was a young man with great entrepreneurial spirit, when he bought the Dragon Hall site. It already contained the Hall House within the former Abbey of Woburn's precinct, and with its own staithe and access to the major thoroughfare of King Street, the large plot of land was ripe for redevelopment. We know that Topps paid to become a freeman in 1421, allowing him the freedom to trade in the city, and that he probably bought the site, then known as Splits, in his mid-20s, built a trading hall in 1427, and became a successful entrepreneur. As his business prospered, he began to rise through the ranks of the civic administration, holding posts such as the sheriff and city treasurer in his late 20s. He was elected mayor on 4 separate occasions and became a burgess or representative of the city borough in the English House of Commons. This stained glass panel from St. Peter Mancroft shows Topps and his family as pious patrons of the church. Donated during his lifetime, it may have helped cement his status among the city's governing elite, and should you visit the church today, you will still be able to see the panel in the bottom right-hand side of the glorious east window. There is a copy of his will which shows that the hall was sold after his death in 1467, but neither his wife nor any of his 7 children continued the business. Topps was not interested in using the site for domestic purposes. It was never his house. He conceived and built a sophisticated trading complex with nothing but business in mind. He could have used John Page's Hall House as a residence, but he converted that into a reception area for his clients, where he fed and watered hungry and tired merchants coming from Europe to Norwich. His most impressive decision was to build his showroom, his trading space, on top of the existing range of buildings adjacent to Page's house. This was a unique configuration at a time when traders usually laid out their wares on the ground in marketplaces, or at best in often poorly lit single-story buildings. It also meant that his property was the first secular and commercial enterprise to be seen as visitors approached the city by boat, apart from the Norman castle in the centre of Norwich. And of course, he already had a private staithe or quay to handle his imports and exports. The trading complex was focused on the riverine links to the coast. Here, goods were loaded and unloaded using a large man-powered crane on the dockside. A gravelled path led directly up to the warehouse area of the building, probably through a great brick arch and into high-ceilinged storage rooms. His main source of profit came from trading, specifically the cloth trade. He is described as a mercer, a cloth merchant, though he also dealt in luxuries like wines, spices and pottery, and commodities such as salt and barley. A successful merchant needed premises to store and display his goods, ideally with good transport links. He was financially involved in many areas of business, including property ownership, leasing, and possibly money lending. As will be seen, Topps's business approach was all about impressing his clients and the citizens of Norwich, but he adopted a pragmatic and functional approach to those areas of his complex which the customers would not see. This view of the working area at the rear of the building shows the overhang of the showroom above, using jettying to increase the selling area by a width of some 4 meters, while at the same time providing a weatherproof canopy below, where produce could be temporarily stored during inclement periods. The projecting timbers were roughly hewn. Why spend good money where it was not needed? Tops's entrepreneurial pizzazz became apparent at the entrance to his reception area. Whereas John Page's front door had been framed with a simple but attractive ogee-shaped arch, Tops added an imposing outer surround for emphasis. The gargoyles and shields would have been the medieval equivalent of a neon-lit shopfront, and he may have sourced the ostentatious masonry from a 15th century reclamation yard and had his builders cement it to the wall. If the river-facing side of the complex was the commercial working part, the view from King Street served quite a different purpose. Every element seems to be intended to impress Tops's wealthy clients, other merchants visiting to buy and sell, and the general public passing by. Although today the structure appears to be a row of old houses, in 1427 it was one entity with a grandeur and size that had not been seen before, and it was clearly not a domestic dwelling. The windows shown in this image are 16th to 19th century additions, whereas Tops had installed 3 huge oriel windows into his first floor showroom frontage overlooking King Street. He also designed the building with an extravagant use of oak wall posts, many more than were needed for its structural integrity, and then infilled with expensive bricks. The exterior walls would have been plastered between the timbers, creating a contrasting black and white effect. And the timber-framed first floor projects out on a jetty formed by the ends of the floor beams, adding to the stylish and aesthetically attractive appeal of his enterprise. It was mentioned earlier that a showroom above ground level would have been a daring and innovative arrangement, and a grand internal staircase added to the shopping experience for visitors. As his customers ascended the stairs, a 7-light mullioned window illuminated their passage, giving a privileged view into the working area of the complex. Glass was extremely costly and generally reserved for high-status buildings such as churches. Once again, Tops was being deliberately extravagant. For merchants used to showrooms lit dimly by lanterns or candles, the light which flooded in from the windows on either side of the Great Hall must have been truly awe-inspiring. Architectural theory points to the use of light and illumination in medieval buildings as a tool in the creation and maintenance of power and status in relationships, and it must have been used by him to intimidate or enhance the status of his clients. Robert Tops's use of expensive materials extended to the very structure of the building itself. The crown post roof and timber framing of the showroom utilizes much more oak than is necessary for its structural stability. Dendrochronology, the study of tree rings, puts the age of the timbers as being felled in a nearby wood in the spring of 1427. Because green oak has to be used quickly after being cut, or it becomes iron hard if left to season, that is how we know the precise age of the building. It would have been prefabricated off-site, the timbers numbered, and then the whole structure disassembled, then carried by horse and cart to Norwich for its final assembly on top of the existing walls of John Page's earlier range of buildings. The Great Hall is the focal point of the story of Robert Tops and his role in Norwich's illustrious past. In Tops's time, his trading complex was called Splits. It only came to be known as Dragon Hall in the 1980s. But dragons were a key motif for the mercer and his hall, and they feature strongly in Norwich's history. St George is the city's patron, and the Guild of St George, founded in 1385, became a prominent and elite social institution, celebrating the saint's feast day and performing acts of charity for its members and the needy. By prominently displaying a dragon in the spandrel of the Great Hall's beams, Robert Topps was advertising the fact that he was a member of that elevated guild, and it was safe and wise to do business with him. Only one dragon survives today, but it is probable that each spandrel had its own. They were carved from fine-grained Baltic wood, and the sole survivor retains its original colour scheme: red wings tipped with gold, green body and foliate tail, a red tongue and pale gold teeth. It is not flying, but seems to be stealthily creeping upwards towards the roof. It might be interpreted as a metaphor for Topps's rise from humble and unknown origins up through the civil ranks to prosperity and a place in history. We now turn to the function of the showroom itself, regarded as unique in Europe, as it was owned by one individual as opposed to a group of merchants or a guild. This artist's reconstruction shows the showroom in the mid-15th century. Merchants in high-status clothing buy and sell the latest luxuries produced locally or freshly imported from the near continent. The oriel half-bay window on the right allowed sunshine and light to flood into the hall, and carved and painted dragons in all the triangular spandrels added a decorative touch and a symbolic message. At the far end, a partition screen with staircase rising from the reception area below separates the sales floor from the financial and deal-making activity. At the business end, in the South Hall, a scribe or bookkeeper is shown recording the transactions, while Topps offers one of his clients a drink and some food to seal the deal. The fire blazing away may be considered artistic license. It is an anachronism, as fireplaces and chimneys were not introduced to Dragon Hall until the building was redeveloped in the 16th century. The brightly coloured staining of the wood framework is accurate, and patches can still be seen today. Also extant is the small rectangular squint in the wall behind Topps. This little window looked down into the reception area below and allowed the mercer to check on who might be on their way up so he could see and be ready to welcome a new potential customer. Norwich was an important centre for the quality control and distribution of cloth. Topps's principal trading activity was the export of cloth, and particularly broadcloth and worsted in an unfinished condition. This was spun from long fibre wool and took its name from the Norfolk village of Worsted. Master weavers in Belgium wanted the unfinished white cloth, and they were more adept at processing the material to give improved colours and finer textures, thereby increasing its value. Topps then re-imported these more expensive fabrics to sell from his showroom. He also broadened his range of imports to include textile industry dyes and tools, building materials such as Swedish iron, Baltic timber, and pitch and tiles from the Low Countries. From further afield he had wine shipped in from France, along with delicate Venetian glass and exotic spices from the Far East. However, although Norwich was an important and wealthy trading centre, it was never in the same league as the continental cities. By 1450, Topps had achieved a very prominent position in the city and among Norfolk gentry. His acquisition of a coat of arms became the pinnacle of his ambition when he purchased a property in Great Melton just south of Norwich. He adapted the simple existing design by adding a rebus, a visual pun of 3 spinning tops, to represent his name. With Tops's passing in 1467, we know from his will that he directed that his property be sold to pay for 2 priests to pray for his soul and those of his wife, family and relations. He left his country estate at Melton to his son, Robert Jr., but quite soon Dragon Hall was subdivided and became gentry townhouses over the next 100 years. Thereafter it became progressively partitioned off and ceilings fitted so that the trading hall effectively disappeared. In the 16th or 17th centuries, and in line with the latest fashion trends in home improvements, huge chimneys were installed which reached from the basement through the roof of the townhouses. One amusing anecdote relating to the massive brick substructure that remains extant concerns a young lad who was part of a guided tour of the hall. Most visitors, when asked what the structure might be, answer, "It's a fireplace, or perhaps an oven." The boy's confident response was, "Oh, that's the entrance to the London Underground." Even the poor dragon was hidden away in an attic. As the population of Norwich increased, the large yards behind the great houses filled with small tenements. The wealthy inhabitants moved out towards the leafy suburbs of Brackendale and Trowse, and by the 19th century King Street became an industrial area, focused around the port and associated industries like brewing. The site became a slum area, which was not cleared until the 1930s establishment of council estates, to which the impoverished residents were resettled. The 1841 census showed that up to 150 men, women and children occupied the site and Dragon Hall, which was by then called the Old Barge Building, from the pub of the same name, and it was home to some 80 people. Most were tradesmen or labourers, including a cordwainer or shoemaker and his 7 children, Harry Self, a cowkeeper, George Plummer, the carpenter, a boat builder, dressmaker, gardener, and a number of lodgers. What appears to be a row of 6 properties today was actually that in the 1930s, and still within the memory of some Norwich residents, especially those who have not moved away from the King Street community in the old ward of Conisford. Although it is just one entity today, as it was in Tops's heyday, the postal address for Dragon Hall remains 115 to 123 King Street. It is remarkable that this iconic building has essentially the same structure, shape and composition that it had 600 years ago, although changes to its internal configuration hid its original identity. The earliest 20th century reference to Dragon Hall, then known as the Old Barge Inn, was in a 1937 coronation souvenir booklet, in which it was thought to have been the house of Sir William Boleyn, who had died in 1505. Eastern Daily Press columnist Whiffler subsequently wrote a number of articles between 1939 and 1941 referring to it inconsistently as a rich man's mansion, some sort of monastery, then, more accurately, a merchant's cloth hall. It was Alfred Hassel Smith, founder of the UEA's Centre for East Anglian Studies, who made the first recorded internal inspection of the complex in 1966 and discovered the iconic dragon. In 1979, Norwich City Council bought the property for £16,000 from the Watney Man Brewery in order to conserve a clearly important building. Over the next 8 years, the council spent £300,000 to make it safe and weatherproof, but the city did not have the wherewithal to maintain an empty, invaluable heritage asset. In 1987, the Norfolk and Norwich Heritage Trust was formed by interested local people, academics, archaeologists, historians and professionals such as architects. The aim was to open it to the public as a heritage and educational centre, and then raise sufficient funds to restore the building to its original 14th century glory. In an unusual decision for a Grade 1 listed building, English Heritage allowed the complete restoration of the hall to reflect its initial use. The huge chimneys were demolished, all the old partitions and ceilings removed, and outbuildings dismantled. As a precursor to an application for heritage lottery funding, more archaeological work was carried out in the area between the hall and the river, and the origins of one of the central sheds confirmed. 2,000 fish bones were found on the site of the old smokehouse. Before that took place, Chris Barringer, the renowned UEA historian who was chair of the trust, proposed the renaming of the old barge inn site, which was changed to Dragon Hall. It was an inspired marketing decision, as the new name caught the imagination of the general public, and particularly those institutions who had been asked to fund the restoration project. But all the activity on the site and the new name was met with hostility by some. King Street residents recruited the local press to run a "Hands off the old barge" campaign. The change was said to be ridiculous and that the Dragon had sunk their old barge. Part of old England would disappear, and those wanting to change things were outsiders, not city folk, and were just a bunch of middle-class academics overriding the views of local working-class people. One of Barringer's friends from Heatherset History Society told him it sounded like a Chinese takeaway or something from Beowulf. But the new name stuck, and the Heritage Lottery Fund awarded a £1.4 million grant in 2004. This was not to be a mock medieval reconstruction or plain extension. The new educational wing and glass gallery were designed to be architecturally exciting and unashamedly 21st century. The latest phase in Dragon Hall's history was underway. Tops's glorious trading hall had been restored, leaving 80% of the original 15th century timbers in situ. It was ready for visitors and became a unique venue for events. Themed medieval Christmas fairs became a popular addition to Norwich's events calendar, along with beer festivals and business conferences. Educational activities were an important aspect of the Heritage Centre, including school visits and archive and historical research group meetings. It was the home for the King Street Community Voices project and Norwich Twinning Committee, which promoted the city's ties with Rouen, Koblenz and Novi Sad. Wedding and civil ceremonies and theatrical performances were memorable, intimate and financially rewarding for the Trust. Dragon Hall Heritage volunteers organised special events for local history and community groups on subjects such as medieval medicine, and performances were given by the Dragon Hall Mummers Group. There was a lively programme of external talks with expert speakers visiting village halls and community centres across Norfolk to give illustrated presentations on subjects like the history of Dragon Hall or the life and times of Robert Topps. The hall was open regularly to visitors off the street who might choose a self-conducted audio tour or opt to learn its fascinating history from a qualified guide. The transformation of the hall from a near derelict building to its rebirth as an accurate embodiment of a unique medieval trading hall had been completed with style and panache. Now the hall was buzzing with life that might have equalled the flow of merchants and workers using the building in the mid-15th century. But there had been constant financial pressure on the Norfolk and Norwich Heritage Trust, both during the renovation process and then in the structural maintenance of such an ancient and fragile building, and the funding of activities such as the educational programs that were being provided. Whereas Tops's operations were a great commercial success, the same could not be said for the 21st century enterprise, and the Dragon began to face economically hard times. From 2013 onwards, operational costs exceeded income. Dragon Hall's location was not ideal, as it was off the beaten track for most tourists, so the visitor numbers which had been forecast in the business plan never materialised. Because it was not a traditional museum with artefacts to see or touch, it had less appeal to families or younger visitors. Dragon Hall's significance lay in its architecture and its ever-evolving story. The period of economic austerity in the UK from 2010 meant that all government and local council budgets were cut, and that included funding for educational programmes, one of the principal activities at Dragon Hall. Perhaps the greatest blow came with the opening up of wedding venues across the land. Wedding receptions were the largest contributor to the Trust's coffers, but quite rapidly, happy couples were looking further afield for their special days and opting for venues in more aesthetically pleasing surroundings with on-site parking facilities. Dragon Hall did not score highly on either of those counts. Even support grants from sympathetic charities, which had once been happy to be aligned with such a flagship heritage project, began to dry up. So it was with a heavy heart that in 2015 the trustees passed a resolution that the lease they held on the hall would have to be terminated and handed back to the City Council. What would a cash-stuck council do with a heritage asset which was not able to survive in the real world? They might opt to use it as a storage facility for old office furniture, or seal it off and simply keep it weatherproofed. Or perhaps the lease could be let to a restaurant chain or fast food outlet, so that King Street could have its very own Dragon Hall Wetherspoon, or McDonald's. Heaven forbid. But, most fortunately, that potential disaster was avoided. Norwich for centuries has been a place of ideas where the power of words has changed lives. In the late 14th century, Julian of Norwich's Revelations of Divine Love was the first book written in English by a woman. The Norfolk and Norwich Subscription Library was the first library to be established by a corporation outside London in 1608. And in 1701 the Norwich Post was the earliest truly provincial English newspaper. Even today, the Millennium Library at the Forum is accredited with the highest readership per head of population in the country. This is and was a literary city. It was good fortune indeed that at the same time the City Council was looking for a new leaseholder for Dragon Hall, the Writers' Centre Norwich, which had led the successful bid for the city to become England's first UNESCO City of Literature in 2012, was looking for a new home, away from its cramped offices in Princes Street. In 2015, they moved into Dragon Hall. Funded by the Arts Council, the University of East Anglia and Norwich City Council, that vibrant organisation would have the financial security to operate and maintain Dragon Hall into the future. And from 2018 they became the National Centre for Writing, and their objectives now are to celebrate and explore the artistic and social power of creative writing and literary translation, both in this country and around the world. The Dragon Hall site in Conisford tells the tale of 1,000 years of Norwich people from the Anglo-Saxon Scandinavian period to the 21st century. The ever-changing use of the iconic building now continues in a different guise, and the National Centre for Writing will be ideal custodians into the future, trading stories instead of textiles. The National Centre for Writing has formed a joint venture with the Dragon Hall Heritage Volunteers to help conserve and share knowledge accumulated over the last 45 years. This presentation has been part of that sharing process.